Hi, good morning. My name is Lisa Hayes, and I'm the Director of Collections here at the Library Society. I want to welcome everybody here this morning. I just have a couple of notes here. Let me see. So I'd like to welcome you to our book club discussion of The Great Gatsby. For those of you who may be new to our book club group, we don't usually choose books that are 100 years old, but we did hope to choose a classic for one of our programs, and it worked out really well that The Great Gatsby was celebrating a big birthday. I'd like to thank the members of our committee presenting this morning. We have Barbara Hagerty, Tina Wardrop, and Susan Porter. Thank you all. And I offer a special thanks to Caroline Milbank for pointing Diana Hambleton toward a book in her library that contains some really wonderful images for the program this morning. Thank you, Caroline and Diana. I know it will be an interesting discussion this morning. We do encourage your participation. So we will be coming around later with a microphone for your questions and comments. I hope you'll take part in that. And I want to tell you our next book club is going to be October 22nd with a book yet to be determined. We're going to be moving the start time for our book club going forward from 10:30 to 11:30. So just be aware, starting October 22nd, we'll be meeting at 11:30 instead. Thank you again for being here. Please take a moment to make sure your phones are on silent, and we'll get started. Thank you, Barbara, Diana, and Tina again, and thank you all.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I gotta get off my whatever. Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Porter, and I'm really just the sidekick to Barbara. I'll get started talking a little bit about F. Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda. Our book club has wanted to do a classic for ages, so lucky for us that The Great Gatsby just happened to turn 100 this year to give us something to talk about. I wanted to also introduce Tina Wardrop, who will follow Barbara with the questions. Where's this? There we go. The copious correspondence between F. Scott Fitzgerald and his editor at Scribner and Co., Maxwell Perkins, provides us with a wonderful window into the relationship between an author and his editor. And for those of you here today who are old enough to remember the fine art of letter writing, it is an incredible example of two very articulate and eloquent men who write these beautiful letters to one another, so I highly recommend finding those. Most importantly, for the purpose of this discussion today, however, is that these letters reveal the mindset of an author as he continually strives to outdo himself artistically while at the same time staying afloat financially. Fitzgerald wrote Perkins, "With the aid you have given me, I can now make Gatsby perfect." At the time, Fitzgerald, already the author of two wildly successful novels, This Side of Paradise and The Beautiful and the Damned, was considered the voice for his generation. Despite Fitzgerald's optimism for the book, however, The Great Gatsby was published in 1925 to mixed reviews and failed to generate the money that would subsidize Fitzgerald's increasingly exorbitant lifestyle. Years later, the author would write to a Princeton classmate saying, "Even the most enthusiastic reviewers of Gatsby had not the slightest idea what that book was about." The Great Gatsby is set in 1922 in the Jazz Age, but foreshadows a more timeless message. The Roaring Twenties illustrated America's collective reaction to the horrors of World War I and the Spanish flu. Fueled by an unbound stock market and the end of a Victorian code of propriety, the author paints a picture of a hedonistic, materialistic, and ultimately combustible world. Fitzgerald, a product of a more grounded Midwest and a Catholic upbringing, describes a society that has lost its moral center. Readers who read the book when it was released were often distracted by the beautiful language and failed to see Fitzgerald's warning that there would be a price to pay. The 20s ended with the stock market crash and Fitzgerald's stories of exorbitant wealth and wild abandon completely fell out of favor. At the time of his death in 1940 from a heart attack, his last royalty check was $13.30, which reflected the sales for the last quarter for all of his books. The revival of Great Gatsby came slowly. Partly energized by his Princeton classmates, the biggest boost for the book's resurgence occurred when it was issued as an armed services edition, a small pocket-sized paperback, and given to the 150,000 troops going over to fight World War II. One of these soldiers was J.D. Salinger. F. Scott Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1898 during the first year of what would become known as the American Century. Following America's victory in the Spanish-American War, the United States was seen as a global power. New York was the second biggest city in the world, and American industry was booming. Later in life, Fitzgerald referred to his generation as the Great Believers. Born to power and intense nationalism, we were inheritors of a world of hope. While the time of great national optimism, however, the early years of Fitzgerald's life were a time of turbulence for his immediate family. In 1897, his father, Edward Fitzgerald, experienced job failures with changes that took him to Buffalo, then Syracuse, and then finally back to St. Paul. It was the beginning of a peripatetic lifestyle that lasted until Fitzgerald left for Princeton. His father's career difficulties were the source of financial insecurities and humiliation that would plague Fitzgerald's boyhood. Joel Cabot, a Fitzgerald historian, explains, time and again we see in Fitzgerald's life and writing his proximity to the elite, his fascination and frustration with them, how he is with them but not really of them. Fitzgerald, blessed from an early age with remarkable skills of observation and memory, took advantage of his outsider perspective to chronicle those in his vicinity, but not necessarily in his inner circle. According to David Brown's biography of the author, Fitzgerald and many others grew up reading books such as the Harvard Episodes and the Princeton Stories that offered examples of athletic glory and social success while in college. These Horatio Alger type books still really mattered at that time. The Newman School in Pennsylvania, which was a boarding school, followed by Princeton, was Fitzgerald's entree into what he perceived as the fabulous East. Another Fitzgerald biographer, Scott Donaldson, observed that many of Fitzgerald's classmates who attended more prestigious schools and came from wealthier families were less caught up in the struggle for social dominance at Princeton than he was. His success at Princeton was based on neither academic prowess or athletic ability, but rather his literary talents already apparent at such a young age. It was Fitzgerald's first romantic relationship, however, with Ginevra King, one of the fabulous four debutantes of Chicago at the time, that taught him the brutal lesson of how social status can work. Although Ginevra toyed with Fitzgerald, she never actually took him seriously and finally listened to her father's advice. Poor boys don't think of marrying rich girls. Ginevra was most likely the inspiration for Daisy, an emotionally cool rich girl who liked to play at romance, but who understood the ultimate importance of status and money. Fitzgerald dropped out of Princeton after his sophomore year and joined the Army. During his tour through several southern cities, he met Zelda Sayre at a country club dance in Montgomery, Alabama. Part of Fitzgerald's attraction to Zelda can be traced to her social status. Although the Sayres did not belong to the stratum of great plantations, her family was considered one of the finest in Alabama. Her father was a judge and had served on the Montgomery City Council. More than just a desired Southern belle, however, the 18-year-old beauty challenged the boundaries of propriety in ways that intrigued Fitzgerald. She rode on motorcycles, smoked in public, chewed gum, danced cheek to cheek, and was happy to sneak out of her room at midnight to swim in the Potomac Creek and down corn liquor and gin. Fitzgerald was completely smitten. According to Edmund Wilson, however, it would be a mistake to read social status as the only reason for the maturation of their friendship and love. They were kindred spirits from the very beginning. Scott and Zelda were both romantics. They wanted fame, success, and glamour. Challenging the status quo, their search for an intense and authentic life together led them to be really the first celebrity couple. Throughout their life together, Scott created scrapbooks of their escapades, which included newspaper clippings, reviews of Scott's books, and stories and plays. Many readers are aware of the sad trajectory of Zelda's life. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, Zelda died when a fire burned down the mental institution where she lived in Asheville, North Carolina. However, on a more optimistic note, she was ever eager to establish an identity separate from her famous husband, and managed to carve out a small artistic existence for herself. She is the author of Save Me the Waltz, which was published in 1920, and she adored ballet and created wonderful paper dolls, which let's see if I see. Okay, maybe paper dolls are next. Yep, there they are. Okay. Paper dolls, and which have just been made into a book by her granddaughter. Shortly after Fitzgerald's death, she painted this wonderful gouache of the Brooklyn Bridge, and which recalled the shivering New York of her early time there with Scott when they were young. Sorry, I've never done this before. Sober at the end of his life, Fitzgerald managed to find some degree of peace. He became a devoted father to Scotty, encouraging her to take advantage of every academic opportunity in Vassar. Opportunities he felt he had squandered himself while at Princeton. Finally, Scotty his daughter wrote, "In my next reincarnation, I may not choose to be the daughter of a famous author. The pay is good, and there are fringe benefits but the working conditions are hazardous. I suppose it is impossible for writers to form the habit of inventing people, building them up and tearing them down, and moving them around like paper dolls, without doing somewhat the same thing with live ones. Good writers are essentially nutcrackers, exposing the scandalous condition of the human soul." Oops. The Great Gatsby was like a stone that dropped into a river. Since its publication, the story has reverberated through our culture in more ways than I have time to enumerate here today. For those of you who are interested in learning more, I would suggest reading A.O. Scott's article in the New York Times, "It's Gatsby's World, We're Just Living in It." Now Barbara Hagerty will explain the novel to you. Oh, you need this.
Good morning. It has been my pleasure over the past 2 months to revisit The Great Gatsby, a novel I first read in college many years ago. Now 100 years old, this slim novel has, I think, held up to the test of time and seems evergreen, with its still fresh and relevant themes of the American dream, the divisions and rigidity of class structures, the idea of self-invention, that is, at any time, we can invent or reinvent ourselves, much as the hardscrabble, impoverished farm boy, Jimmy Gaps, became the elegant and sophisticated gentleman, J. Gatsby. The pursuit of the American dream is the overarching theme of the novel. The American dream is the belief that every person, regardless of background or origins, may pursue and attain their goals, such as financial success, fame, social position. While the actual phrase, the American dream, was not minted until 1931 by an historian named James Truslow Adams, the idea of the dream is rooted in the aspirations of the early colonists who settled America, seeking religious freedom, ownership of land, self-governance, and upward mobility. To live in America was to live in the land of opportunity. But by the 1920s, the innocence and unlimited opportunity were no more. Scott Fitzgerald perceived the era as decadent and morally permissive. After World War II, the economy flourished, and along with it, libertine mores, loose morals, the emergence of the automobile culture, flapper culture, and during Prohibition, bootlegging, and the accompanying corruption. That Gatsby meets such a spectacularly tragic fate underscores Fitzgerald's disillusionment with the dream. Several times throughout the novel, Gatsby gazes at a green light visible across the bay from Daisy Buchanan's dock. The green light symbolizes for Gatsby the attainability of his dream, not only to be wealthy and powerful, but to win back his old love, Daisy, who is now married to a member of the powerful East Coast elite, and whose mansion is situated just across the bay from his own. Only 3 or 4 months later, the dream has spectacularly collapsed. Nick muses, "As I sat there, brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked up the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, in the orgasmic future that year by year recedes before us." In the novel, most of the main characters, Gatsby, Nick Carraway, and Daisy Faye Buchanan, have moved from what Fitzgerald calls the West and what we would call the Midwest to the East. By the 1920s, the Wild West had been explored and established. Go West, young man, was no longer the mantra. The frontier was no more. Many people were now making their way to the East Coast to pursue their fortunes, sometimes by way of East Coast colleges. The new frontier was Wall Street. Nick, the narrator, comes from Minnesota by way of Yale University. Daisy is a former debutante from Louisville, Kentucky, and Jay Gatsby is from North Dakota. The theme of East and West is further reinforced by the fictional settlements of East Egg and West Egg on Long Island. East Egg has been established by the wealthy elite. It is an enclave for privileged American aristocrats like Tom and Daisy. It represents old money. West Egg, by contrast, is populated by arrivists like Gatsby, who made their fortunes more recently. It's a place populated by the nouveau riche and represents new money. The West, generally to Fitzgerald, the character of Gatsby himself notwithstanding, stands for honesty, decency, wholesomeness, and good values. The East stands for entitlement, elitism, privilege, and moral decay. Class structures and strictures are also an important theme of the book and govern much of the plot. The novel presents a microcosm of America's classes, from the elite as evidenced by the Buchanans, to the aspirational as exemplified by Gatsby, to the upper middle class as illustrated by narrator Nick, to the criminal or borderline class as exemplified by underworld figure Maya Wolfsheim, and finally to the blue collar, in the persons of garage owner George Wilson and his wife, his ultimately doomed wife, Myrtle. While Gatsby amasses staggering wealth, throws lavish parties, lives in an American castle surrounded by servants, and has acquired the manners and affectations of an English gentleman, for example, in his use of the phrase "old sport" to address Nick, he ultimately cannot escape the confines of his origins. A girl like Daisy, almost an American princess, is not available to a poseur like Gatsby, and this is the fundamental truth that Gatsby fails to grasp. The American dream backfires for the Wilsons, too. Myrtle is unable to latch on to her lover, Tom Buchanan, as an escape from her dreary life, and George, too, the honest but beaten down by life garage owner, pays the ultimate price in an ending that is not only tragic, but serves as a further indictment of the so-called American dream. In writing this classic, which is just a little over 47,000 words, Fitzgerald deliberately set out to write something not seen before in American letters. In 1922, he declared, "I want to write something new, something extraordinary and beautiful and simply and intricately patterned." He wanted to push the boundaries of the literary form. He wanted to break away from such contemporaries as Sinclair Lewis, Theodore Dreiser, Edith Wharton, and Willa Cather. "I shall never write another document novel," he announced to a friend, Thomas Boyd, in 1923. "I have decided to be a pure artist and experiment in form and emotion." And in 1924, he declared to his editor, Maxwell Perkins, "I think my novel is about the best American novel ever written." We can discuss that later. Fitzgerald's narrative technique was influenced in part by writer Joseph Conrad. Conrad's narrator of The Heart of Darkness, Marlowe, for instance, like Nick Carraway, serves as both a commentator and a storyteller, offering ruminations and comments on events as they unfold, thereby adding perspective and a point of view. According to the Norton Critical Edition of The Great Gatsby, Conrad's preface to one of his novels, quote, forms a kind of manifesto for literary impressionism, and readers will recognize how Fitzgerald, through his canny use of imagery and metaphor, aimed to realize the ambition that Conrad articulated when he wrote, "My trick, which I'm trying to achieve, is, by the power of the written word, to make you hear, to make you feel. It is, before all, to make you see." In addition, Fitzgerald, like Conrad, chose to let carefully chosen symbols such as the green light, the optician sign, and the Valley of the Ashes do much of the heavy lifting in the book. T.S. Eliot's magisterial poem, The Wasteland, appeared in 1922. The two works are connected by their portrayal of the despair, chaos, and disjointedness of the period following World War I. While Eliot's poem focuses on the devastation of post-war Europe, and Fitzgerald's depicts an American malaise, both works describe a wasteland. In Europe, it is the devastation of the cities and the countryside. In Fitzgerald's novel, it is a blighted, smoke-filled area between Long Island and Manhattan, now called Flushing Meadows and Corona Park, where the Wilson's gas station was located, where ash heaps and garbage piles accumulated, and through which both the commuter train and the roadway ran. Fitzgerald sent Eliot an autographed copy of Great Gatsby, praising him as the greatest poet in any language. Eliot, in reply, wrote to Fitzgerald saying, "The novel interested me and excited me more than any new novel I have seen, either English or American, for a number of years." He added, "It seems to me the first step that American fiction has taken since Henry James." Fitzgerald deliberated over a number of titles for his novel, including Among Ash Heaps and Millionaires, On the Road to West Egg, Under the Red, White, and Blue, the gold-hatted Gatsby, the high-bouncing lover, and two titles that reference a character in the Satyricon. In the 1st century AD, Petronius wrote the Satyricon, in which Trimalchio, not unlike in which Trimalchio acquired wealth. He was a former slave and he acquired wealth as a wine merchant, not unlike Gatsby's career as a bootlegger, and hosted extravagant, decadent parties. Fitzgerald wanted to entitle his novel at one point either Trimalchio or Trimalchio in West Egg, but his editor, Maxwell Perkins, finally persuaded him to go with The Great Gatsby because the Trimalchio reference was one, too obscure and too difficult to pronounce. References to almost mythic levels of wealth permeate The Great Gatsby. In the 1st chapter, Nick, the narrator, recently arrived in West Egg and about to embark on a career as a bond salesman, states that he bought 12 volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. References to owls, to eyes, and to owl eyes recur throughout the novel, symbolically suggesting perception and the ability to see or not see reality. The most prominent of these images is the billboard of the optician, Dr. T.J. Appleberg, whose spectacled eyes watch over the garbage heaps in the Valley of the Ashes and symbolize the moral and spiritual blindness of the characters. The eyes also suggest the presence of a detached and indifferent God who watches but does not intervene. George Wilson, the garage owner, remarks that he told his unfaithful wife, Berta, that she might fool me, but she couldn't fool God. God sees everything. Similarly, a minor character named Owl Eyes attends Gatsby's parties. Examining the books in Gatsby's library, he observes that while the books are genuine, their pages are uncut. They are unread. Their wisdom goes unconsulted. Later, Owl Eyes is one of the few attendees at Gatsby's forlorn funeral in the rain. The poor son of a bitch, he says, his last gesture is to take off his glasses and wipe them again, outside and in. These engines turn the wheels of The Great Gatsby. Powerful themes, symbolism, fresh, modern lyrical language, realistic dialogue, plot, and some of the most indelible characters ever created in American fiction. Only one of the characters changes in any substantial way, and that is Nick. He is not omniscient. He does not possess insight into every character or situation, but he does mediate between the worlds of the Buchanans and Gatsby. His narration is retrospective, thoughtful, ruminative. He provides a consciousness to the novel and a point of view. He says, "In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in the world haven't had the advantages that you've had." He goes on to say that because he reserves making judgments, people have always confided in him. "I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget, as my father snobbishly suggested, and as I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth." Nick's opening reflections establish, first, that the novel is concerned with hierarchy of class, and second, that Nick is a natural confidant And third, that he sees himself as possessing a moral compass, a fundamental decency. Everyone suspects himself of at least one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am, he says, one of the few honest people I have ever known. The modest bungalow that Nick rents is next door to Gatsby's, quote, colossal affair, just steps away, like some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with its tower, marble swimming pool, and over 40 acres of lawn and garden. And of course, its glamorous, pale yellow Rolls-Royce coupe in the garage. This proximity perfectly positions Nick as a go-between. In his brief autobiography at the novel's beginning, Nick reveals himself to be a young person of privilege, though far less privileged than Tom Buchanan. He comes from a prominent Minnesota family, descended from the noble Scottish Dukes of Buccleuch. The actual founder of his own bloodline was his great-uncle, who, in a gesture of supreme privilege, actually sent a substitute to fight in his place in the Civil War, and afterwards founded a successful wholesale hardware business. After attending Yale and serving in World War I, Nick moves to New York, where his father has agreed to finance him for 1 year. By the novel's conclusion, Nick has experienced 3 violent deaths, the callous refusal of the Buchanans to take responsibility for anything, the dissolution of Gatsby's magnificent obsession, the spectacular failure of his dream, and his own personal disillusionment. Nick resolves to move back home to the Midwest, to the world of his family's hardware store. In the West, he finds virtue and values missing from his experience of the East Coast. He has had enough. He goes home. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Gatsby is a cipher, a mystery. He is slippery, shadowy, intentionally vague. Born into a poor farm family around 1890, Gatsby attended St. Olaf College briefly, but dropped out because he disliked doing the menial work he had to do to pay his tuition. Subsequently, he ended up working for a wealthy copper magnate, Dan Cody, to whom he became an assistant and a protege. It was in this period that Jimmy was exposed to privilege and luxury. He might have become Cody's heir upon his death, but Cody's mistress absconded with the $25,000 intended for Gatsby. He then enlisted in the army and spent a brief interlude in Kentucky before fighting in Europe, where he met Daisy, had a brief affair with her, and became obsessed with winning her, even after her marriage to Tom Buchanan. He also spent 5 months after the war at Oxford University before coming to New York, meeting up with gangster Wolfsheim and making his fortune illegally. As Gatsby sustains his invention by embellishing his accomplishments at other times by supplying only vague replies and scant information, his mystique is bolstered by his immense personal charisma. Part of his strategy is to be charmingly inscrutable. He had one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself. The truth was, says Nick, that J. Gatsby, West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was the Son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his Father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So, he invented just the sort of J. Gatsby that a 17-year-old would be likely to invent. And to this conception, he was faithful to the end. His ambition for material success was superseded only by his obsession with Daisy, and it is the pursuit of his romantic ideal that Gatsby, for all his shadiness and dishonesty, becomes human, touching, relatable. When he finally reunites with her, his heart beat faster and faster. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. And then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Poignantly, Gatsby remains true to his romantic obsession until the end, taking responsible for Myrtle's death when it was actually Daisy who had been driving the fatal car, Gatsby's pale yellow Rolls Royce. After the car crash, the Buchanans abruptly leave East Egg. Nick observes, they were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess that they had made. As the novel moves toward its dark denouement, Nick grows increasingly disillusioned and pays Gatsby the only compliment he ever gave him. They're a rotten crowd, he says. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. 2 years later, living back home in Minnesota and having processed the whole tawdry and poignant experience, Nick offers an assessment of Gatsby, which I believe is how Fitzgerald ultimately wanted the complex character of J. Gatsby to be perceived. Yes, he was corrupt, dishonest, and a faker, who fell prey to all the temptations of the American dream. Yet, he also possessed an idealistic, romantic nature, demonstrated loyalty, fealty, gallantry, chivalry, and generosity to his dying breath. As Nick muses of Gatsby and of his now concluded role of confidant, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers, and we have a few that we will propose to you all to think about or respond to, and then if you have questions, you will ask them. This is a really interactive part of the session, and if people want to stay later to continue talking about it, we'll happy to do that. First question I have is, how many people have reread the book prior to coming here today? Okay, so quite a few. And I guess for those that raised your hand, what was the reaction reading it the second time, assuming the first time you read it was in high school many years ago? And then,
Please, raise your hand if we got a couple microphones to help. And when you use the microphone, please speak in the top microphone. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it more. Of course, I've seen the movies, I've read the book, and the story, but it struck me that his language and use of the various, I'm not an English teacher, but the various things that he did, like using Nick as his focus, and then the characters were well developed, and I just thought it was beautifully written, and I had not felt that way relative to the first second time I read it, so.
When I read it, I was probably 16 years old and lacking any respect at all, understand what it's talking about. So rereading it now gives you a great deal more perspective and certainly you're able to appreciate the imagery and the things he's writing about.
I have to say I liked it a lot less than I did when I read it in high school. Maybe it was because I didn't have Miss Joanne Prato helping me decipher it. But it just seemed like it was so much darker than I remembered it being. And I really appreciated the language much more. But I really disliked all the characters, even Nick. I felt some sympathy for Jordan Baker. But other than that, I have to say I enjoyed the language more, but the characterization and the plot less. Just personally.
I'm going to second that. I think we're giving Gatsby a little too much. The reason Myrtle died, he sort of was the careless one because he's trying to split up the family. He's trying to. There's a daughter that's never been mentioned. It's forgotten about entirely. He's a crook, really, the true sense of the word. So I kind of, reading it again a little older in life, you kind of lose this idea of Gatsby being a figure to emulate.
I was struck with how timely it is. And it really reflects what's going on in our world today with this enormous wealth that some people have and how they pursue so much more wealth. And I think the captains of industry at that time were in oil and minerals. But today it's in technology.
It's sort of amazing, right?
I suppose the upshot of this is that the American dream is deeply tainted, and as has already been said, it somewhat resonates today. And also, those of you who research this is not on the topic of the novel so much, but the speculation about the role of Zelda in helping in Shakespeare's achievement. Some people suggest that she was a great help to him in his writing. I wonder if anybody would comment on that.
Can I just say one thing? I just had a conversation with someone about would Fitzgerald have been Fitzgerald without Zelda, because ultimately Zelda did not help Fitzgerald live his life. I mean, she was a spendthrift and she was crazy and, she was not a help. But I'm not so sure in the beginning if he could have done any of it without Zelda, because I think they were a pair, and they lived this incredible life that motivated him to write great books. But ultimately, she sort of took him down. That's my opinion. But I'm sure other people have opinions about what position Zelda played. Anybody?
Well, the fact that she had schizophrenia and was in and out of mental hospitals most of her life, and certainly even died in hospital fire, I think probably had a big impact on him. They were huge partiers, so that was probably very destructive to other people. Does anybody else have anything? I think you mentioned something as to one of the questions about how the similarities of the early 1920s are to today. And for example, we're just coming off of the pandemic, and in the 1920s we're coming off of the Spanish flu. So there are other similarities that we want to talk about in terms of what's going on economically and socially. Does anybody have any observations about that with the characters and how they exhibit some of the socio-economic issues that are going on? It would be like Marvel and George Wilson being the sort of the underclass and being taken advantage of by the wealthy, the Tommy Cannon, and sort of discarded and not heard about. Let me switch the question then to the fact that Fitzgerald used a lot of people in his life to create these characters. You mentioned Daisy being his girlfriend, the woman he dated.
Right.
And he himself is reflected in the Gatsby character in somewhat Nick. And he has all of these people around him, but all of them had issues. They were complex, and they had things that really weren't good about them, weren't positive. Are there any characters that you can think of that you have any sympathy for? Or which of the characters would you have the most sympathy for?
If I may, I'll respond to the first question you had. And I found it interesting in the characters that the only relationship that survived in this book were Tom and Daisy. And they have a toxic relationship. But I think they are typical in that the very wealthy, or you can use money to encapsulate yourself, right? Shield yourself from all the bad stuff of the world. But I thought that was quite interesting that every other relationship exploded or imploded or whatever. So, yeah, disintegrate is a better word. But that's what I found interesting, how kind of protect your own, stay within your own clan, and even how miserable it might be, you're going to let your money shield you.
Do you think they stayed married? Gus, do you think they stayed married?
I think so. I think they needed each other in a sort of interdependent kind of weird way, right? And Daisy accepted Tom, and Tom accepted Daisy for her. And they worked for each other, right?
Right. I think you're probably right.
Yes, the lady who mentioned how dark it is went to the heart of the matter, I think. And I really appreciated the reference to Conrad and the wasteland in World War I. But we have to remember that virtually all of the great American novels are pitch black. The Sound of the Fury, Moby Dick, Melville wrote a great essay in which he praised his good friend Nathaniel Hawthorne for his power of blackness. Power of blackness. Melville says it well, he says no in thunder. And so do all of our great writers, including T.S. Eliot.
That's a great point, thank you.
Going back to the character questions, as I said, I felt some sympathy for Jordan Baker because she was a talented athlete who fell in with this toxic couple. And there are a couple of scenes where she expresses some tenderness to Nick, and he talks about her laying her cheek on his coat, and it seems like she wants a relationship so desperately. She wants something, I think, real in her life. And then, he made that comment about I'm the most honest person you know, but then after one of those tender scenes, he says, oh, but I really need to get out of some big entanglement I've got back in the West. So much for his honesty. I don't know whether with Jordan or with this entanglement, but I did feel some empathy for her. I still felt
What was so interesting, speaking of Jordan, Nick identified that she was a liar.
She was what?
A liar.
Oh, right.
And there were two references to that about how he caught her in some kind of a lie, and then the foreshadowing of that was there was rumor that she had moved a ball in a game. So I really wanted her to be a good part of the book, but then I was disappointed. She too had failed.
So what were people's reactions to Gatsby? Is he a hero? And he's the true
I
reason.
love Gatsby. He was my favorite character. Also, referencing Fitzgerald using the people he knew in his books. The character in Tender as the Night is definitely based on Zelda's mental decline. If you've read Tender as the Night, you would see that's very clear. I don't think it was political at all because they don't mention politics. I think we're reading too much into that. But I'll just say, I loved Jay Gatsby.
I have been agreeing at the end of the day. I truly believe that Jay Gatsby is a tragic hero. Yeah, he did a lot of unscrupulous things, but in the end, he had no idea. He still believed that he was going to get Daisy. He never, but from the beginning, it was never going to happen. And he believed it all that time, and he did all that just so that he could have Daisy with him. And it was never going to happen. And that's why I think he's tragic. He was, like Nick says, the most hopeful person he's ever met, and that's an understatement. Because he was very hopeful, but he was out of sleep, and he just didn't know. And I actually felt sorry for Gatsby. So
that brings us to kind of close the commentary on this. One question about the ending. What was the reaction to the ending? Was it something that you expected, or I guess all you felt make it happen?
It's not really tragic because he doesn't actually know Daisy's going to refuse him yet. So he dies somewhat happy.
Right.
So he loses a certain element of the tragedy. But I mean, I was shifting now. Now I'm going to praise Gatsby. I'm the one who called my program. That's the point. I think the book is highly ironic. For instance, the first and last compliment Nick gives them is they're a rotten bunch. And we kind of talk about this. They're all pretty rotten in some aspects, and they're all pretty nice in some aspects. And so that's sort of that's what makes it timeless. That's why you're here today. I'm 100 years later still talking about it. So I'll just.
Does anybody have a question they want to ask? You have some.
You commented early on that it was not critically well received. Does anyone know when it began to gain traction and become the novel it is today?
Couldn't hear that.
Sorry?
Could you repeat? We couldn't.
Yes, you commented early on that the book was not critically well received. So I'm wondering, does anyone know when the book began to gain traction and become as popular as it is today?
Yes. To some degree, it started to come back into favor during World War II when, for some weird reason, I don't know why, they gave all of the soldiers, 150,000 soldiers going to Europe, a pack of cigarettes and a copy of The Great Gatsby. So that sort of started the momentum. And then to some degree, his college roommates, a lot of whom became editors, really tried to keep him going. I mean, one of them edited The Last Tycoon, and when Fitzgerald died, that book was sort of halfway edited, halfway written. I mean, there was a great effort on the behalf of his, on the part rather of his good friends, but some of it is just that people rediscovered it, and it was short, so it was assigned a lot in high schools, as we all know, because we all read it. But it gained its own traction really after a certain point. Do you have any other answers? Okay.
I have a question. Can you ladies identify an F. Scott Fitzgerald of today?
Oh, wow. Good question.
Or a woman who is an F. Scott Fitzgerald?
That's a great question.
A woman just wrote a novel, and I haven't read it, in which it is brand new, in which she imagines Gatsby as a female protagonist.
What's the do you know the title, Barbara? No. We'll have to look into that. I can't think of. Can you? I mean, do you have any ideas of who would? This brings me to another question which might help us answer your question, which is, I'm sure a lot of you have seen both movies, the movie with Gatsby portrayed by Robert Redford, and then the second one, DiCaprio. Have any of you seen those two movies? Do we have a favorite Gatsby? Which one is your favorite? We have a couple of Robert Redfords. Anybody else? Did anybody like Leonardo DiCaprio better?
I did.
You did? Why, Tom?
I thought it was, in my mind, more true to the book. I kind of watched them both in the last 3 months. And I thought that Leo, I can't call him.
Leo, right.
Really hit it better than Robert Redford did. And, I thought that the story was related better. It got terrible reviews. I mean, my wife and I watched it, thought it was great, and then we read the reviews and, whatever at the time, it got terrible. And, I thought it was a good movie, and I thought it was very true to the book.
He's by far the glitzier Gatsby, right? The more razzmatazz Gatsby. I mean, I think Redford is a more sympathetic person, I guess.
I'm sorry. I know you can't do it, fortunately. I just thought that the way the story played out, and I actually haven't rewatched it, so it's been 6 or 8 months since I watched it. And then I watched Robert Redford maybe 6 weeks ago. And Robert Redford's obviously better looking, but it's just, I didn't think it was as true to the story as the character was. I like the setting better. I like the characters. I mean, this book has everything an English teacher wants to teach because it has plot, it has characters, it has character flaws, it has, devices. It has all the things that you need to teach about a novel. And it's short, it's easy to read, but it's certainly not the great American novel. It is a good book, and I think that's why we're discussing it.
Thank you.
I would like to comment too, on the book that if you notice in there, and I couldn't help being of the persuasion that I am, all of the men's weakness, if they had one, was a woman. It was Myrtle for, right? And of course it was Daisy for Tom and Nick. So the thought of switching this around and changing the protagonist to a female, the her one weakness was the man, I'm curious how that would play out. I'm just curious, but anyway, also, one comment that I didn't realize that it was Fitzgerald that coined the term the jazz age. I didn't realize that came from him. Anybody else?
Came from Fitzgerald?
That. Yeah.
I didn't know that, but thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the questions we can get to since the time it was really what is the novel portray about gender roles and what does it say about women? And there's a lot of there in that discussion as well.
You know, there's another movie, Gatsby movie, with Alan Ladd, and it was a gangster movie. And basically, I think probably this is a gangster story. You know? So that may have been so this.
Oh, no, yeah. So, I like how you mentioned the West had closed 1890. World War I destroyed the old world. Also during this time, innumerable immigrants are coming from places that had never, at that time, immigrated to America, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. So you sort of had this old world. And then you also have 5 Midwesterners, and they're all Midwesterners, including these. They're intimating this European aristocracy. They had chateaus and gorgeous-style architectures. I think Casey's mentioned English golf shoes. They sort of, I think the ultimate question of what we should be, and might not get answered, is like, what is American identity? Is it melting pot? Is it this sort of old world refashioned into the new? And it's sort of, at that time, again, the old world is kind of gone after World War I. And that was sort of what I kind of took from it. It's can it even be answered yet? Was it answered at the time? That's sort of what kind of makes it, again, a timeless work that doesn't really answer it, and it doesn't try to state any answer. So let's come back to the question.
But also, the old world has been exposed by World War I. Ezra Pound called it the old bitch on the disease.
Gosh.
So that's part of the context. That's part of the context of this novel too. In other words, this Gilded Age imitation of Europe in the novel is ridiculous after World War I, and even darkly ironic, because World War I has exposed the utter emptiness, like the wasteland of Europe itself. And so all these ignorant American millionaires are trying to pretend to be fake French aristocrats are ridiculous on that level alone, but even more ridiculous because Europe itself has demonstrated utter dead end of its civilization in World War I.
Also, more or less, the great moral crusade of prohibition was going on this time, especially the land of freedom. That's something else that's sort of, yeah, I would take exception to TSL, like, waste of the same Europe. Yes. I will get into that later.
Is there anything else before we want to say? Thank you for coming. It was a fun book for them to work on.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.